Hello, 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 hello. We're going to continue our discussion of Chapter 4, Lesson 2, talking all about the differences in America between rural life and urban life, whether that means you're out there on the farm with your shovel and your wheelbarrow, or whether it means you're going to be in the city living in those skyscrapers or working in a factory. So let's continue that conversation, taking a look at how urban life is different from rural life. And today we're going to talk all about living conditions. And you can see that highlighted here, this concept of living conditions. And the idea of a living condition, it's pretty simple. And what we're talking about here really is when we say living conditions, it's really the quality of where you live. You know, is it a nice house? Is it an apartment? Is it a mansion? And the services that are available to you. And what we're going to be taking a look at here today, specifically as we kind of go through this, is how is the quality of life, primarily in this lesson anyway, in cities controlled by bosses and political machines. So our focus today is going to be on urban life, and it's going to be on these people that control it. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about why it is that you see living conditions controlled by people, and we're going to spend a little time talking about what those living conditions were themselves. And it's worth noting, I think it's worth doing that, because take a look here at U.S. urban and rural population over the last 110 years. And what you can see is that here, at least in the very beginning of the 1900s, there were more people living in the countryside, in rural areas of America, towns and farms and the middle of nowhere, than there were living in cities and urban areas, right? And that's what you need to take away from this, right? That urban is city, okay, and that rural is country or farm. But that as time passes, and certainly within the time frame that we're talking about here, leading up to about 1914, give or take, a little bit less than that, the number of Americans that are living in cities will outpace those living in rural areas. Tremendously so. If the 20th century has been anything when it comes to population patterns, it's the number of people living within cities as compared to the country. So we want to take a look at what living conditions were like for people in these cities and who controlled those living conditions. So we're going to start by taking a look at how most Americans at this point in time are moving to cities. New York is always the example that people will turn to when they look at this, and it grew by 3.5 million people in 40 years. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, well, that's not too crazy, right? 38.5 million people in 40 years, given the number of people that live there now, like 9 million or something. But it's actually a pretty complex growth, and it creates a lot of different challenges, because in 1790, there was only 5% of our population living in cities. That's a really, 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 really tiny component of our population living in those cities. But by 1790, the number of people that were living in these cities, the number was dramatically, or by 1870 rather, the number was dramatically higher. It was 26%. So in less than 100 years, you're seeing an incredible growth in urban population. So why does that matter, right? Because you have to do something with these people. Just think about it. Where do these people live? These millions of people that are coming in. There's no houses for them. There's no apartments for them. Those things don't just magically appear. And what about the infrastructure for all of these millions that are arriving in an incredibly short period of time? You know, from the perspective of someone who's 14, 15, 40 years is a really freaking long time. But from the perspective of somebody who's 40, that's not even a lifetime. That's half a life. I mean, you're talking within the lifespan of just half a lifespan of just one person. 3.5 million people move into your neighborhood. Well, what do you do with them? Like the sewage, the hospitals, the teachers, the education, the electricity, trash, even roads and transportation. Where and how do you get all of these things in place to meet the demand of all of these people showing up? And importantly, whenever it comes to the houses, the roads, the food, whatever it is, who's paying for this? Is it the taxpayers? Is it the city themselves? Is it the state the city's in? Is it the federal government? I mean, all of these things, they're serious questions. And when you have so much growth happening so fast, one of the things you're going to see for sure in America is going to be corruption take place. And we'll get to that. But why do these people move to cities anyway, right? What's the point of moving to a city anyhow? And the answer there, at least in terms of that we need to worry about anyway, is that there's better jobs here, that there are opportunities for better pay in cities, and if you make enough money, right, and you do well enough, there are things like electricity and plumbing and entertainment. These are, kind of attractive, and there are things growing up in cities that you begin to see to help people accommodate this mass influx, right? This question of where do they live and who pays for it that we had shown you here before. Well, one of the ways that we deal with that is by building up, right? By building up, not out. By introducing the concept of a skyscraper in the 1870s and 1880s. That we're going to be able to take people from their small little village in the middle of nowhere, and we're going to be able to put them into a big city like this. And if you think I'm crazy or that I'm kind of making this up, I'm not. This is a Russian village where many of these immigrants from Eastern Europe were coming. From just this kind of place. A small little village, farming really the only kind of career open to you. Maybe electricity if you're lucky, but probably not really. Yeah, one-story shacks, right? You're talking about that kind of an existence to this kind of an existence. That's insane. But it gives you an understanding of why people might want to come, right? Because they were looking at all of these things that would be better in their lives. Whether it's pay, amenities. Wait, what's that word called again? These things that you live there and how you live there? That's right. They're living conditions. People are coming for those better living conditions. And I got to tell you, the living conditions as better, they're not all they're cracked up to be. I don't want you to think that this is kind of the modern American. Because for most Americans, it is not the modern American city. So, what can we tell it and how can we tell it? As we're talking about living conditions controlled by bosses and political machines and how urban life is different from rural life, what I want to focus on here, particularly when it comes to these living conditions, are living conditions for the average person, the person who was a worker at the time in a factory, the person who was coming to America. Because working class and lower class families, they had a different experience in America. Most of the people we're talking about right now are working and lower class families, and they're going to live in something called a tenement. And we're going to try and give you a firsthand, as much as we can, experience with this tomorrow. But what you need to know is that these are multi-family apartment buildings. So you've got here multiple families living in one apartment building, 3 or 4 people living together in a 1 or 2 room apartment. Now, that doesn't seem like it's too big of a deal until you start to realize what these places look like. This is what your neighborhood begins to look like when you start crowding family upon family upon family into this kind of an area. These are tenements. So here's one tenement house, here's another tenement house, and another, and so on down the line. And you're packing all these people into these one tiny little rooms or these tiny little buildings. And let me just do that math for you so you understand just how packed in you really are. If you do this math, you have 10 families per floor living in one of these buildings. That's about, if you have 4 people per family, 40 people per floor. Not a big deal until you realize that's 5 floors a building. That's 200 people living in one building. So that's 200 people in this building, and 200 more in this building, and 200 more in that building. That's 200 more in that building. In just these 5 highlighted buildings, there are 1,000 people living there. That's insane when you think about how closely packed together these people are going to be. And we're not talking about houses that are spread out, right? This is the average distance between those houses. You could reach out from one building here's a window and touch the other building. There is no ventilation, there is no air conditioning, there is no air moving, and there are no, what else don't you really see, right? No windows. You would be lucky if you had a window facing out onto another building in a tenement home. These things were packed in like sardines in a can, and the people were packed in like sardines in a can as well. Just take a look at this little family right here. This is a tenement apartment. If these people are lucky, they have one other room, and you can see it, right? Right here in the back is the other room that they have. So you have a kitchen, which also functions as a bedroom. Look, here's the stove, okay? This stove is probably fed, by the way, by coal, and there's no outside windows, so there's no, like, way to vent this. The smoke, the coal fumes, yeah, that's inside your apartment. Here is one bed for people, right? This is probably the door outside to the hallway. Here's a crib. This little tiny thing back here is a table, and this probably back here functions as additional beds and living spaces. Well, where's the bathroom, Mr. D? Oh, that bathroom? That's a shared bathroom in the hallway that you're sharing with the 40 other people on that floor. It's not mixed. There's not one for women and one for men. Yeah, that's 40 people sharing one bathroom. And if you're unlucky, that bathroom isn't even inside on one per floor. It's outside in the courtyard. Somewhere down here, underneath all the laundry, is where your bathroom might be if you're unlucky and live in an old tenement house. So you are really, really packed in here. And just think about the living conditions of people packed in here. The stench, the smell. What do you do with your garbage? What about disease? Or, God help us, a fire. What might happen in the case of a fire? This is a catastrophic place to be, and it is not a nice place to be. There is no privacy, domestic violence. Everything is seen, everything is heard, and it is dirty. This is the basement of a tenement house in Brooklyn. This is nearby where many, many, many people would live in their tenements. And it becomes essentially a trash heap, a trash dump, because there is no regular trash pickup. Now you imagine the smell of your garbage building up and building up and building up and being thrown into a place like this. The rot, the stink. Ugh. It's enough to make your face be all kinds of gross, make you all be like, oh, God, I don't want to live there. That's revolting. I think that's enough to be, really kind of make you that way, right? I mean, it really is a gross, gross, gross place to be. Is it any wonder that the living conditions in these places pour out onto the streets? You can see here, right, the tenements lined up door to door to door to door. And can you imagine why you'd want to stay in there, particularly in the summertime or the springtime? You'd want to be out on the streets. This is an average street in the Lower East Side in New York City. You can see how all of life just kind of flows out onto the streets. Not everyone, I want to say, not everyone lives in situations like this. There are people, particularly those who are in the middle class, that are expanding due to better jobs and different kinds of better pay, different kinds of jobs. And doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers, etc., they all begin to grow up in part because we need them to pay for those people and to help those people, I should say, who are moving into cities, right? The more people moving into cities, the more doctors you need, the more lawyers, the more engineers, the more teachers, etc. And for the first time, what you're going to see in America is a city that is separated by class in terms of where you live, not just where or what you do. Now, what is this a map of? This is a map of Brooklyn. Now, why do I bring this up? A couple of reasons. It used to be that you would have rich and poor living together throughout New York City. Okay, simple to understand. Some neighborhoods were rich neighborhoods, some neighborhoods were poor neighborhoods. But as you have tremendous numbers of people moving quicker and quicker and quicker into the city, housing grows up that is specifically designed for just these poor people flowing into our city. And it develops primarily in this region right here. This is the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This becomes headquarters, or like Immigrant Central, and it spreads up the east side of Manhattan Island in New York City. Where you used to see the middle class living in this area, also alongside the poor, you're going to see them begin to move to surrounding areas outside of where those tenements are located. This area that I highlighted here for you in red is a great example of this. This is a place called Bedford-Stuyvesant. Brooklyn becomes one of the places that we see the first emergence of middle-class neighborhoods in New York City. And you go from 10 families per floor in a house like this to one family living in a house like this. These are called brownstones. They're still in Bedford-Stuyvesant. They were built, many of them, back in the 1880s and 1900s, early 1900s. They're still places where people live today, still beautiful homes. But these were the first middle-class houses that you would have seen built in a place like New York City as people got away from that incredibly crowded, dense, thick tenement lifestyle that we saw on this image right here. So living conditions were not easy, for sure. But I think the question is, were the living conditions that way on purpose, or were they that way because of circumstance? Who is it that created these conditions? Well, in part, the people that created these conditions are bosses and political machines. Now, all right, so first off, what's a boss and what's a political machine? A political machine here is a group of people who work for a political party that controls local government. And their whole goal here was to trade votes for whatever you needed. If you were an immigrant and you came to the city for the first time, you lived in one of those tenements, then you might want to trade your vote for that political party for a job or for a place to stay or food or even protection. And what you see then are the people in charge of these political machines, in charge of these political parties, who are called bosses. Those are the ones that are in charge. They're the party boss. So first, this image here of what a political machine looks like and how it works. It's a lot like a pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, in red, is the party, all right, represented by this building. And the person who controls that party is the boss. And then underneath that are people who do different things for the boss and the party. And they had names. They were called captains or ward bosses. A ward is kind of like a neighborhood. And those people would distribute favors and jobs, money, police protection, whatever it is that you needed in exchange for your vote or doing whatever favors they needed you to do. You kept that party in power. They kept those jobs and rewards coming your way. All in exchange for the votes. Here you can see where it says the ballot. So that's the voting box. And what you have is the party boss in charge of counting the votes. In fact, this is Boss Tweed. As long as I count the votes, what are you going to do about it anyway? In other words, if he's the guy that's in control and he's the guy counting the votes, then he's the guy that's going to win. And they would make sure they would win, either honestly or dishonestly. One of my favorite stories is that they would take a guy, here's a little guy, right? They would take him out to vote, doot, 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 and he would have a mustache and a beard and he would go and vote. And after he voted, they would take him to the barber and they'd shave his beard. And then he'd go and he'd vote again with the mustache. And then they'd take him back to the barber and they'd shave his mustache and he'd vote again. They would do whatever they needed to do to get the votes to win. Okay, so understand that. It's about winning. And yeah, I don't want you thinking that this was all just, happy-go-lucky, like you get whatever you need in exchange for your vote. There was a real question about whether or not these party bosses were getting rich from graft, obtaining money illegally, like through a bribe. You could do this with bribes or selling permits to friends, etc. One of the most richest and most famous bosses was Boss Tweed, that guy from the image up here that I showed you. He led the Tammany Hall machine. That's the name of the organization, Tammany Hall. It was Democrats, New York Democrats. He led them for that machine led New York City politics for almost 60 years. But what it comes down to is what some of these politicians in the machines call honest versus dishonest graft. And a guy named Alfred Plunkett gave us this quote, and he called this honest graft. I could get nothing at a bargain but a big piece of swamp, but I took it fast enough and held on to it. What turned out was just what I counted on. They couldn't make the park complete without Plunkett's swamp, and they had to pay a good price for it. Anything dishonest in that? And he says, there's nothing dishonest about that. He says that's honest graft, because what he knew ahead of time is that they were building this park. And so he went looking for land, and he got a big piece of swamp at a bargain. What's wrong with that? And then he sells it for a good price. That's not dishonest. That's honest graft. That's honest using information to your advantage. If it was honest when you did something like this for your party, for your city, for your people, that's honest graft. Because in Plunkett's view, what does the people get, right? What does the people get? What does the city get? They get a park. That's pretty darn good. What does he get? A good price for his money. Dishonest graft, in the mind of Plunkett, would be graft that is done just for yourself. You don't do it to benefit anyone else. You do it to just benefit yourself. That's what he would call dishonest graft. Any way you cut it, it doesn't matter whether it's honest graft or dishonest graft, it's still graft. You're still obtaining money using unfair information illegally. But these were the people that controlled things. These are the people that made sure you did what they wanted you to do. And we'll talk more about them in class tomorrow, and we'll take a look at those living conditions of the working class poor in their tenement homes.